Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. While it's still early in Season 3 and balance feels pretty good, there is always the concern of the Exodia comp coming back. And one of the biggest reasons, I think, for an Exodia comp to ever be existing in a Mythic Plus environment is when there's too much friction in being able to form your group from the very beginning. Dungeons, notably, are going to have various dispel profiles, whether there's poisons, diseases, curses, and sometimes they're weighted more heavily or less heavily, depending on the dungeons you're in. Notably, for example, you're going to have some dungeons back in the day like Halls of Atonement, where you really needed a curse dispel. But then you might go into Warcraft Manor, and it's nice to have, but not mandatory to have. Whereas having Disease Dispel in that dungeon would be mandatory to have because it makes a really big difference both on the Lord and Lady Wakecrest fight, but also on a lot of the trash mobs that are casting dispellable diseases onto players. And so that's a huge difference. You also have to deal with Battle Res, Bloodlust, and a number of buffs which increase survivability and increase damage to a large margin, where you might have like caster comps or melee comps that are all built specifically to engineer the maximum damage or survivability altogether. I think that when balance for the DPS specs or tank specs is usually really strong, all of the healers are balanced pretty well to heal through the damage. And I will say they've actually done a pretty active job about balancing healers' output, even damage output in a dungeon environment, much more so than they've done in other expansions. The problem is that healers can often be chosen to fill in the gaps for all of these groups because there is so much friction in these dungeons and how you are able to build a working composition. Of course, you can make anything work, but just anything that makes the path of least resistance that much smoother is, of course, going to be taken by these players. And so that's where it really comes down to where healers are imbalanced, or this healer dominates others, or other tanks are dominating others, when the utility of one of those roles is so powerful, and they also are bringing the damage, the healing, whatever output on top of it. In Dragonflight Season 1, we had a really good mix of strong damage dealers, tanks, and healers on hand that you were able to mix and match your compositions a lot. You might have, let's say, all of the monk specs being in a good position, but you wouldn't put 3 of the monks in the same group. You wouldn't put Brew, Mistweaver, Windwalker all in the same group because you'd miss out on a lot of your buffs. Instead, you would be able to have a monk and a paladin, or a monk and a demon hunter, and you would be able to merge the groups together by bringing in a really big mix of different classes and not wanting to have the same specs altogether. This is nice, and it's cool to be seeing all the different colors together. You got to keep in mind there's a lot of different classes on a lot of different specs in the game at this point, and so always having a different class and always trying to play with different classes also really forces people down the path of like avoiding other people who play their same class, because you need to have a massively wide range of different buffs and debuffs to apply to enemies and shutdowns, and on it goes. That's where we got into the situation of like Season 2, where Augmentation Evoker was obviously too strong. It was basically a support spec, even though they said it wasn't a support spec. It was also bringing the Bloodlust. It was bringing the Poison Dispel. It was bringing extra survivability, way too much damage, and buffing the healers and the tanks all together. And so you had this one spec that brings things that nobody else is able to bring, and then you start forming a composition around those benefits and who receives the greatest amount of those benefits to be able to level up your keys to the highest possible. Now, they've done a number of nerfs to Augmentation Evoker thus far, but we're still seeing it really heavily represented in a Keystone environment, and that's only going to continue as we get pushing into higher level M+. Now that we're over a month into the patch, this is the point in the season where everyone's going to start kind of coalescing and finding out what the path to least resistance is, and finding out which of the specs is going to make sure they have the easiest time possible to clear through it. We've done some meta spotlights and everything in the past. Prop Pally and Vengeance Demon Hunter are looking really strong. There's a good mix of healers that are doing really high keys. Aug is still super high up. Demonology, even Fire Mage look to be on the rise. Havoc Demon Hunter is insane. And we don't really have any other class changes or even any other hints of class changes kind of coming around the corner. And so this might be the area where people get the pressure to re-roll, people get the pressure to be mixing things up a little bit more. And that is where it trickles down into lower groups as a result of finding that path of least resistance. But how do we get out of that area where you're always trying to build this perfect meta composition and the argument of, well, there's always a best comp and you can't stop people from wanting to chase the meta? Well, in an ideal world, you might get a Dragonflight Season 1 where the spec balance is so good that people are able to build a variety of different group compositions based on their needs. But also, there's a number of areas of the game that could actually have good homogenization. And I know whenever that word gets used, it's always that visceral response of like, don't homogenize anything. And I understand. I will say, Paladin did get a battle res in Dragonflight, and I don't think it really did much to ruin the experience of other specs in the game that had battle res. I also think that if they went as far as giving other specs battle res, or even making it role-based, like giving it to all healers, maybe making it role-based to give lust to certain damage dealers, maybe melee damage dealers, having less dispels or less differing dispels that would have such massive requirements, or maybe changing all mandatory dispels into magical effects and having diseases, poisons, and curses be nice little extras. I think the way Warcraft does their curses is actually quite good, but the way poisons exist or diseases exist in Darkheart Thicket, and yes, they do at the end of the dungeon, those are all mandatory dispels. Otherwise, somebody's gonna die or, get very, very close to it without a major defensive on hand. Those are examples of a bad dispel profile that you have to deal with. And I think being able to add a measured level of homogenization to the things that provide lots of friction to the dungeons is actually insanely important. If you don't have a disease dispel for your tank at the end of Darkheart Thicket, where they get a massive healing reduction that must be dispelled, your tank will just die. The poisoners in Darkheart Thicket will have massive ticking damage, and the players will explode whenever the debuff expires if it's not dispelled. It is really, really punishing for not having the poison dispel. We even saw it at the start of the expansion with Algathar Academy on the tree boss, where the stacking poisons would eventually get to a point where they would kill you off your tank, and not having the poison was a surefire way to get you sent back to the beginning of the dungeon. There's a number of those things that don't actually ruin people's gameplay experience, but they sort of just exist to push you to invite other classes and not other specializations within your class as a result. I think that the game, and M+ in particular, would actually work well for this, and there is precedence to a lot of this where how raid buffs used to work back in the day. You used to be able to have a lot of overlap with classes bringing the same raid buffs. You would have, I believe it was like Druid and Paladin bringing like Blessing of Kings, Mark of the Wild, and they were doing the same buff. You would have, I think, Shaman and Priest would both bring Stamina to the raid. Hunter would notably have their pets, and they'd have a whole host of pets that could fill in buffs for the group to be able to change around the buff depending on what the needs of that composition were. Those things did a really, really good job of reducing friction in the group and allowing you to welcome more people into your group just based off their personality or their gameplay or whatever that isn't directly related to their class identity. And as a result, I think provides a lot more enjoyable of a gameplay experience. I don't think everybody should have Warlock Gateway. I don't think everybody should have speed boosts. I don't think everybody should be having those kind of abilities that are very active and noticeable in your gameplay. But I think the specs that just bring a buff and you're just bringing them to bring a buff to the table don't really add a lot to the equation. And then there's the question of, well, is this going to bring back like triple rogue compositions like we saw in BFA, or is it going to bring like all the warlocks we saw in Moth that get crazy stacked or something in a raid environment because we're not forced to be bringing, let's say, a druid like in the latest Race to World First and a Mirror Drasil just so we can have Mark of the Wild? Well, maybe, but also I don't think that we should be worrying about what the Race to World First teams are doing as a sign of overall balance. Or also, they should be looking to balance the game in a position where you do want to be bringing everything to the table, as they have made specific mechanics where priests are mind-controlling random dudes to jump them off platforms. Why aren't they actually in a position where they're making mechanics that are requiring certain classes or specializations? Oh wait, they did! Farak literally put magic debuffs on the entire raid, which required a revival, and nothing else was going to work unless you had the entire raid go dwarf and save their dwarf abilities for that specific moment in time. So there's already precedence there. I would argue if Race to World First or some turbo high M plus type of setup that is totally unrealistic for the rest of the game community happens, It happens. And that shouldn't be a problem for the other 99% of players. I think there's way too much stress for the common individual getting into an M+ environment or even getting into a raid environment where you need to check off all these buffs regardless of the performance of that player, and that you're shoehorned into bringing classes just for the sake of the buffs that they bring to everybody else. And it's actually just not a positive thing. They continue to be able to add it on into the raid as you see all of these different specs that are added for this kind of poison that the rogue's bringing, the Hunter's Mark, the Wind Fury Totem, and then specs like Elite Shaman who just don't bring any buff or just never brought, right? There's always these like haves and have-nots that exist to the end of time, and I think that reducing a lot of that actually is a positive side of the game. And whether they have hero talents, which are adding some interesting utility to specs, or whether they're using it to just add extra damage, I think that those are always going to be good areas to see. Holy Priest getting Symbol of Hope back in, or Symbol of Hope buffed, I should say, back in Shadowlands actually was a positive thing because it added some utility to the spec that didn't really have it otherwise in a raiding environment. It got to a point where it was a little bit too insane, but then you also have like Mistweaver and Resto Druid, where they're not really bringing that raid-wide damage reduction or raid-wide utility that other healer specs are bringing, and as a result, they're getting pushed down in representation for the race to world first, except, of course, like we've seen out of Amir Jasil, where, you know, Mistweaver just had a mechanic basically designed for it that brought it to the table, in addition to it being just the highest output healer for a prog environment as well. So, some of those little details aside. Overall, I think the War Within is a tremendous opportunity to try it out, but so too is Fated, because we do have a Fated season coming up to cap off Dragonflight, and if we had radical ideas going on for loot, why not start having some radical ideas going on for how specs are going to be represented, how you're able to maybe get bloodlust items that can be used that are miles better than the garbage that you have to deal with as an engineering item. Why not use the opportunity in that season to try radical things to reduce friction in forming M+ groups, that reduce friction in forming raid teams, and allow players to just log on, play with their buddies, and blast. Let me know what you guys think. If you enjoy these type of videos, this sort of speculation for the future, let me know as well. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll catch y'all next time.